there's no question that right now, as Americans, and not just as Americans, as people living in the world, we're experiencing history in real time. It's pretty fascinating. We're going to be talking about what's going on right now in the world for the rest of our lives. We'll look back at this time and say, hey, do you remember that time when the entire world shut down for months and months? And we couldn't do anything. We couldn't go to school. We couldn't go to restaurants. We couldn't go to concerts. We had to stay home for months. When we look at what's been going on, I remember when it started back in mid-March, that last day of school that we had, when it was looking like things were going to be shut down, things were getting really crazy. And then at that time, you start thinking, okay, when does this stop? This has been going on for such a long time. The days kind of meld into each other. You lose track of what's going on in the world, especially if you stay secluded, if you stay quarantined, if you take it pretty seriously. Some people are really, really frustrated with that right now. If you've been following the news at all, you've probably seen what's going on with all of these protests. We had one in Salt Lake City, I think maybe a week ago, 2 weeks ago. I don't know. I'm losing track of time myself. But right now, the big one that's happening is in the state of Michigan. The state of Michigan, and what tends to happen here is that, as usual, things fall under party lines, I guess you could say. Those who are more liberal, or liberal is not the right word, those who are Democrats tend to be very serious about the quarantine, tend to be, we've got to keep things under lock. And those who tend to be more Republican want to get things going. They want to say, hey, let's just live our lives, and if we die, we die. So in the state of Michigan, the governor is a Democrat, and she's becoming more and more popular and powerful in the Democratic Party. People are starting to look at her. She gave the response to the State of the Union address, just to give you an idea of who she is and her politics. And right now there is, I think it was either today or yesterday, there was a group of protesters, and there's the protests are pretty big, but there was a group of protesters who charged into, I think it was the state capitol of Michigan, and carrying guns. Now, they weren't going to use their guns. They were protesters, but and I'm looking at these images of these middle-aged, very American protesters wearing usually Make America Great Again hats and American flags, and they've got their AR-15s, and they're driving their trucks. And I'm like, man, this is America. This is quintessential America. This is what America is. It's a group of people like this protesting. And what are they protesting? The right to go and eat at restaurants for free. Or not for free, but, freely, I guess you could say. When we look at the world stage, America has a reputation for, again, guns are, everybody associates America with guns, and for good reasons, and we're going to get into that today. Everybody associates America with being fat, which, again, we're going to get into today. Everybody associates America with being loud and not obnoxious, but, not rude. I guess obnoxious. Americans are obnoxiously loud, but not obnoxiously rude. And that's our reputation on the world stage. We're very funny people to the rest of the world. But there's a reason why that's the case. There's a reason why all of these things look the way they do in America. And it has to do with the next thing that we get into in our notes today. This is pretty much the basis of Americanism. And it's our first jump into actually applied ethics, no longer ethical theory, but applied ethics. And that is the applied ethics of rights. What we've been doing this semester so far is we've been looking at secular ethics. We're not taking a Catholic approach just yet. Eventually, we may be able to touch on Catholic ethics and how it relates to all of these secular ethical theories. I would have had a lot more time in the school year to do this if we weren't doing the online classes. But we will work with what we have. So regarding this secular morality, secular ethics, there's no framework that's more important for us to understand as Americans than rights, because rights is the basis of American morality. We understand everything as rights. And if we want something to be moral in the United States, we're going to want to start to claim it to be a right. So here's an example. Right now, there's debate about whether or not healthcare is actually a right. Now, if it is a right, then we have to have free healthcare for all individuals living in the United States. And the only reason why we don't is because people are saying it is not a right. There's nowhere, there's nothing codified. There's no understanding that makes us think that healthcare is a right. But if we did understand it as a right, then yeah, everybody would be on board by saying we should have it. We understand everything through the lenses of rights in American law and American morality today. But as evidenced in our classes, it gets kind of difficult to understand what exactly a right is. We had some difficulty trying to determine what a right is. And so if we can't even agree on what a right is, we can't really agree on what rights we actually have. So the best way for us to understand what exactly a right is, and this is a very subjective and a relative understanding of rights because we're only understanding it through individual cultures and individual societies. We're not saying this is part of human nature. The best way for us to understand rights is, what does a culture or a society cherish the most? What needs to be protected the most? And whatever that is tends to be declared a right by that culture. So in the United States, we are very protective of our self-protection. And we've said we have a right to self-protection. We have a right to bear arms in case of the government trying to tell you what to do, which is some people's arguments for what's happening right now in the country. Now, that doesn't exist in any other country, at least generally speaking. Guns are a very American thing. And so even though it's a right for me to own a gun in the United States, I don't have that right if I were to live in, say, Italy or England. So because it is cherished and protected by Americans, we have determined that that's a right. But there's a debate because it seems to us that guns are immoral. They lead to destruction. They lead to death. And so the debate surrounding guns, at least in the United States, is saying, well, even it doesn't matter if it's a right, it's immoral because it's destructive. And something that's ultimately destructive should be considered immoral. See, when we're talking about rights, we're talking about what is morally correct and morally incorrect. So are there any rights that we actually have as human beings? Remember, if we go back to our initial definition of rights that we came up with as a class, let me see if I can find my notes. something you deserve simply because you exist. Is anything that we deserve simply because we exist immoral? This is a little bit difficult to understand. And I think it's a little bit difficult to understand because the very concept of rights is super, super new. It's almost as if it was invented by human beings. Now, you can make the claim that there are a lot of things that humans invented. Maybe we invented the idea of God. Maybe we invented the idea of religion. But those things have been with us since our very beginnings as a species. Rights have not. This is very clearly something that we've invented, because the concept of rights came about only in the 17th century, the 1600s. It didn't come from ancient Greek philosophy. Now, when we look at ancient Greek philosophy, these guys seem to have a pretty good grasp of what it means to be a human being, and yet they had no understanding of these things that we deserved simply because we existed. So that indicates, at least to me, that rights might not be an inherently understood concept. This is something that we have to define for ourselves, and this is something maybe that we have to define as a society. So it seems that we have two options, and you can challenge me on this, but it seems that we have two options. Either rights are a relative subjective thing, or they don't exist in the first place. And it's something that we've just made up entirely. So, as is evidenced by our class discussions on this, there doesn't seem to be a consensus as to a definition of the term right. What is a right? So, regarding the definition and acceptance of rights, it's also really difficult to distinguish two things: legality and morality. Now, something can be legal but immoral, and something could possibly be moral but illegal. So we have to be able to separate those two when discussing rights. And this makes sense when we look at the definition of a philosopher named Ronald Dworkin, who says that to have a right to something is to have a sphere of activity or an area of one's life protected from outside interference. So essentially what a right is to Ronald Dworkin is something that you have or something that you're able to do and nobody can tell you otherwise. They can't take it away from you and they can't say you can't do that. That's what a right is. There's nothing natural about that. That has to be set up by a government. That has to be set up by authority. But it makes sense here. But at the same time, this is why we even have the discussion on rights in the first place. Because there are a lot of concepts of rights that we have, things that we say are rights, that seem to contradict Dworkin's original claim, that don't fit that description. So here are a couple of examples. Supposedly the right to healthcare. Healthcare is great to have, but that requires a lot of taxpayer money. And if you don't want to pay into healthcare, too bad, you have to pay into healthcare. So even though you also have the right to your own property, that property can be seized in order to give others the right to healthcare. The right to a just wage, same thing. As a business owner who has employees, the employer has to sacrifice some of their own possessions to give to that person. And they do so willingly. You can't have somebody work for you for free. That's slavery. However, if somebody from the government tells you, okay, well, you can have an employer, but you have to pay them at least, let's say, $15 an hour, and you're not willing to give up that amount, what's happening is that the government is forcing you to give up your property. Again, you have a right to property. So two rights are conflicting here. And that's directly going against Ronald Dworkin's definition. So if you accept things like the right to health care or the right to a just wage as rights, there has to be something fixed. There has to be an amendment to Dworkin's definition. So a right, remember his original definition, a right is to have a sphere of activity or an area of one's life protected from outside interference. But we have to add, if you're going to accept those things, and in some cases, having a claim on another person or society as a whole to deliver a particular service or facilitate a certain activity. Now, what does this mean? It means that if we're going to accept Dworkin as having the definition to a right, and we're going to accept that definition of his, we have to accept that there has to be some exceptions to the rule. And I'm uncomfortable with that because it means that that first part of his definition is just not true. So if somebody like Ronald Dworkin, who's a very intelligent philosopher, if he can't even adequately answer the question, what is a right? How are we going to go about this? I think we came up with a fairly articulate answer, something you deserve simply because you exist. But then that brings up a really important question. Where does that thing that you deserve, where does it come from? Where do rights come from? Are they part of our human nature, or are they something we invented? Now, if they are part of our nature, why is it that we were totally unaware of their existence until the 1600s? And if there's something we're invented, if they are something that we invented, then why do we define morality based on what is and isn't a right, especially in America? These are really important questions that we need to ask. And then on top of that, here's a really important question. What rights do people, or you can include animals in this discussion, what rights do people have, and what is their source? Where do they come from? Where's the groundwork there that tells us what rights we actually have? We can have a government tell us what rights we have, but then you also have people determining political discussions or framing political discussions around this question. This is my right, or this is not a right. It's a big mess right now, especially in America. So clearly, Ronald Dworkin's not going to help us out at all, because if rights are just things that are just protections that we have, that flies out the window if the thing that you supposedly have protection against is that rule needs to be broken in order for somebody else to have one of their things protected or one of their rights protected. So Dworkin's definition is just not going to work. If there is any validity to rights, it has to be because rights are natural. It has to be because rights are part of our nature. But this is a really good thing, especially as Americans, because we have somebody really important that we can look to understand rights through a natural lens. And that's a very famous guy. He's pretty much the father of American idealism, and that is John Locke. Hopefully you've been studying a lot of John Locke in high school. Very important in history. It's very important in philosophy. Very important in government. Very important in politics. And so let's take a look at John Locke's theory of natural rights. So according to John Locke, all people have natural rights that are given to them by God. Locke is a Christian, so of course he's going to believe that these things that we have that are innate to us come from divine origin. And so what are those rights? He says there's only three, or there's three broad rights. Specifically, the rights to life, the right to liberty, and the right to property. Now, in America, you probably understand You probably understand that phrased a little bit differently by, I think, Thomas Jefferson. It's, I want to say, in the Constitution. I just get Constitution and Declaration of Independence mixed up, so correct me if I'm wrong there. Um, we have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, according to American idealism. But let's stay with John Locke for a second, because Locke believed that if you use your inherent reason, so remember we were able to use our reason when we looked at Kant, we were able to use our reason when we looked at utilitarianism. If you're going to use that tool that's giving you an idea of the way that the world works, the world around you, you're going to find, according to Locke, that all humans are more or less the same in their faculties. Now, what is a faculty? Faculties are, it's a broad term. Think senses, think memory, think reason, think imagination. Think of all of those things that just make you cognizant, that make you a thinker. Now, every single one of you are able to think. Some of you are able to think more than others. Some of you are able to think more successfully than others. Some of you have a very simple understanding of thought. We're all different. But Locke looks at our faculties and says, well, hey, we're all more or less the same. Like, even if somebody is brain dead or somebody is severely mentally deficient, somebody has a very severe mental problem, they're more or less the same to us than they are to any other living thing. And this is why this is going to be really helpful when we're looking at the idea of humanity. And the dignity of humanity and the superiority of humans over other animals. But Locke is going to use that argument that we're all pretty much more or less the same when it comes to our faculties, because he says this means that no person, no individual is naturally controlled by another individual. Now, you're formed by your parents, but you all are at an age where, I'll be honest with you, some of you are probably getting a little bit more intelligent and a little more knowledgeable than your parents are. There comes a time when you surpass your parents, unless your parents are very intelligent. There comes a time when you surpass your parents in that ability. Now, it wasn't a case of them controlling you and then now you control them. It was a case of them forming you, and then you were able to that formation was able to form something greater than they could give you. So it's very clear to us, and it's very clear to Locke that no human can possibly be controlled by another human. Now, there's methods like, brainwashing, where you can manipulate somebody else's thoughts, but you can't control someone. You can't invent somebody's thoughts. That's something that's unique to them. And so if we are all more or less the same, then that means, again, according to Locke, and remember, Locke is living in the 1600s, and so you're going to start asking yourself questions here in a second, which I'll be glad if you do. Locke claims that no person is naturally the property of another. So no one is allowed to take the life of another. So that gives us our first right, the right to life. Now, you're probably looking at slavery. Slavery is inextricably linked to American history. And there's a couple of things we have to understand. Slavery, pre-American slavery, has always existed amongst humanity. And what made American slavery very unique was its racial undertones. Or not even undertones, it's like overtones. It was a big thing that race was tied to slavery in the United States. And that was never really the case before American slavery. Well, it was kind of the case before American slavery, but it was exacerbated in the United States for a couple of reasons, which I can talk about in a second. So if I could be wrong here, but what I would assume Locke's mentality here, and I'm not sure if he is anti-slavery. This phrase makes it sound like he's anti-slavery, but he could very well be under the impression, as most people were at the time and before him, that slavery is just a natural consequence. It's not a natural consequence. It's just a consequence of people's life choices. If you remember studying indentured servitude in your history classes, it would be kind of like that. What Locke is saying here, though, is that this is not a natural thing. It's not natural for humans to be in control of others. Now, what made American slavery so unique was its racial identity, whites owning blacks in the South. Now, this existed in other parts of the world. I mean, you look at Europe, specifically Portugal. Portugal was just atrocious when it came to slavery. And you look at even 19th and 20th century Belgium and their treatment of Africans. Oh, atrocious. I dare you to look that up because it's absolutely awful. But in the United States, and you probably noticed this in the United States, we're not exactly world travelers. We're not exactly we don't have a global mindset. We're very focused in on ourselves. And so what happened is that originally most slaves were coming from the continent of Africa and were brought over by slave traders to the United States, specifically in the South, where that work was needed by plantation owners. And so because the vast majority of slaves were African, it became sort of it became in the mindset of Southerners specifically that being African and being a slave in the United States was one and the same. And so there is this natural buildup of an understanding that being African, or over time African American, meant that you were at least socially inferior, and that bled into the minds of certain people in the United States, who then began to believe that they were naturally inferior. You have to understand that this understanding of slavery and race, specifically in the United States, was not not only did it not always exist, but at the same time it was something that evolved over hundreds and hundreds of years, even before the United States, especially when you look at the slave trade. And this is at least my understanding of why slavery in the United States was racially based. Is a horrible thing that's part of our history, but it's a very good thing that we have Locke as our sort of philosophical architect, because if we don't have a Locke as the guy who determines the way that America treats its citizens, then I don't see the possibility of slavery even being made illegal. And yes, it is a slow build up to that point. It takes 200 years after John Locke existed for us to eliminate slavery in the United States. But the fact that we based our philosophy on Locke is what allowed that to happen. It's a good thing that Americans were split 50-50. Again, this came to the understanding of, well, they are my property, and property is my right. It's my natural right, according to Locke. But then if you're using that language, that this is my right, you're contradicting yourself, because even Locke said no human could naturally be the property of another human being because we are too similar and we cannot control each other. That's not a natural thing. So when you're getting into discussions about rights in the modern age, you have to start thinking about how is the argument being phrased? Because even though you're claiming something to be a right, and even though it may be defined as a right by the government, there's a good possibility, I'm not saying that there is for sure, but there's a good possibility that there might be a contradiction in the way that you treat a right. So if we're continuing with this understanding, that would mean that no adult, now again, we're talking about adults here, we're not talking about children, or at least Locke is not talking about children. No adult is naturally under the control of another adult. You don't have, that just doesn't work. Now, he did understand adults having control over children, because you're raising your child, but no adult is going to be controlled by another adult. And so that gives him the basis of his idea for the right to liberty. You are free from other people. You are not controlled by another human being. And if you are being controlled by another human being, that human being who is controlling you is taking away your right to liberty. So for Locke, to take away either the right to life or your right to liberty directly goes against the natural state of humanity. And again, as a Christian, he's going to believe that this is a direct affront to God's intention for humanity. If you're doing this, you're doing something that's unnatural to our very personhood, our very being. This is what a right is. And this is far more, even though this is using religious language, it's far more articulate and far more accurate of what a right might actually be than, say, Ronald Dworkin's definition. So it's easy for people when they're reading Locke to say, all right, when you're talking about the third right, the right to property, there's an issue here, because you say that no human can control another human. No human can be the property of another human being because it's not natural to us. But at the same time, we didn't create the world. We didn't create the earth. We didn't create land. We didn't create water. So how is it possible for us to say the natural world could be considered property? So regarding property, Locke accepts that the natural world is not naturally owned by humans. However, when someone is the first to add his or her labor to the natural world, so somebody who decides to till the land for farming, somebody who decides to take care of a cow, somebody who decides to plant and water a tree, somebody who decides to sow crops in a field, it becomes their property if they are the first to add labor, because you are giving back to the natural world. This was Locke's argument for and justification for the ownership of property. So each person, according to Locke, owns his own person. Each person owns his own freedom, and each person owns his own labor. And Locke argues that the things of the natural world have almost no value without labor being put into it. If I were to walk out into an empty lot that's filled with grass and is fertile, has fertile soil, it serves no purpose to me as a human being unless I do something to it, unless I can plant seeds in it and I can grow crops and I can eat those crops. There's no value in the same way to a human being if they're not doing anything, essentially. This would be Locke's understanding. There's no value without labor being put into it. So before we leave, I want to leave off with this question. We'll continue with rights next week. And so this will be a question that I want you to think over, and we'll continue with it next week in our next note sheet. Could an atheist accept or at least understand Locke's arguments? Locke is talking a lot about our natural state, the natural state of human beings, the natural roles that we have, the way that we treat the world, the natural world around us, the way that we treat land, the way that we treat animals, the way that we treat water. a lot of it is framed in a religious context, in the fact that God has given us these things, but there's rationality behind it. And as far as I know, I have not been able to find a contradiction in Locke's reasoning in the same way that I found a contradiction in the very secular definition of Ronald Dworkin, who claimed that rights are things that are defined by what we want to have most protected. So stick with that. Stick with that question. Have that question in mind. I'm going to go back to this question, and I want you to have an answer to that question by next week. And so we'll leave it there for now. Remember John Locke, because we're going to go back to him. He's very important. And I do apologize that we're not going to be able to get through too much of the notes, given our certain circumstances. But that does mean that we can spend at least a little bit of time focusing on these applied ethics when it comes to rights. And it does mean that we'll have to rush through or sort of squeeze in Paradiso. But I'm sure we'll be able to work. I'm sure you guys are going to be able to work with these changes. So with that, we'll put rights away for a second and move into Paradiso for tomorrow or Friday, and go back to rights on Monday or Tuesday, actually probably Tuesday. Just remember the question that we leave off with, and we'll get back into rights starting off with that question.